But on the second day, God did not say that it was good. That indicates that there was quite possibly a process that was started on day 2 that was not completed on day 3.
The same day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
Welcome to this episode of Hydroplate Theory University with Hydroplate Theory experts Kevin Lea and Bill Wells.
Well, welcome to our third podcast of HPT University. HPTuniversity.com is our website, an associated YouTube channel, which is Hydroplate Theory University. And I just want to start off by saying we're encouraging you to read the 9th edition of Dr. Walt Brown's book and buy it at Amazon. But after a month of them having hundreds of books, Amazon is still listing it as unavailable, and they are not explaining why it is, except that it's their problem. And so here it is, 7 July of 2026, and we don't know when it's going to become available, but you can still read the 9th edition of Dr. Brown's book at creationscience.com, and there's a flip book tab there. All you have to do is put in your email address, which we're not using for anything else other than to let you know of podcasts and other things that are being added to the website, should you want to be informed. And so you can read that free. So, Bill, why don't you tell us about what we've done the previous 2 podcasts?
Well, the first podcast was an introduction about the man Walt Brown, his integrity and his genius, and introduced you to his hydroplate theory. The second podcast, introduction, was to give Kevin and myself the opportunity to share with you some of our history, what motivates us to take on this task, and which audiences that we hope to minister to with this. The third podcast, this podcast, is an introduction to Walt's first chapter pertaining to the flood of Noah, titled The Hydroplate Theory, an overview, pages 119 through 161 of the 9th edition. And a quote that Dr. Brown has to begin the introductory overview is this: had the events of the global flood been understood when Darwin proposed organic evolution in 1859, evolution and its many adverse social, scientific, and education consequences probably would not have arisen. Here's why. So this podcast will be a 30,000-foot introduction to this very important chapter, and we encourage you to read the entire chapter to gain a more detailed understanding. And Kevin, why don't you cover the 4 phases of the overview?
Yeah, and before that, I'll also say that along with reading the 9th edition, we would encourage you to go to Brian, Bryan, Brian Nichols' YouTube channel, where he has dedicated a chapter, a posting on YouTube of the overview chapter as well. It's going to be a great resource for you to gain extra knowledge. But the things that we're going to go over in this chapter, the chapter is laid out for 4 different phases: the rupture phase, the flood phase, the continental drift phase, and the recovery phase. How did the flood start? How did then the flood continue? And then the continental drift phase, where the continents moved in towards the positions they are today. And then what's happened since the flood, the recovery phase. And Bill and I are going to add the initial assumptions, that are also so important. And that is that the starting assumptions of Dr. Brown's theory based on the Bible. He just took the Bible, which said that there was fountains of the great deep that burst up. That implies that there was water under the crust, and we're going to see the scriptural justification for that. And that there was something that initiated the rupture. So during the creation week, God created the earth with an ocean of water under the crust, and then something led to the rupture. Those are the two assumptions of Dr. Brown's theory based on the Bible. And with those two assumptions, everything else plays out by the laws of physics, as we'll be covering in the next several weeks of doing these podcasts. So, and I want to say too, that even without any knowledge of the Bible, you could say that there was a global flood. I know a lot of people want to deny it mostly because it's in the Bible. That's why they want to deny it, not because they can't see the evidence of a global flood, but they don't want to acknowledge the Bible. But you can see it, but it would be very difficult, I would say almost impossible for us to understand how it occurred without the Bible. So we're going to be covering Bible verses today. And I consider God a very reliable source. Historically, I've studied the Bible for 52 years of being a Christian, and I've never been let down to think that it's been lying to me about anything. And so we're going to go to the source and finding out what happened during that creation week. And so why don't you go through the Hydroplate Theory key assumptions? And this is from page 134 of the 9th edition. So Bill, want to take it from there?
Yeah, Kevin, just to give our audience, those unfamiliar with Dr. Brown's work, we're going to introduce you to something called hydroplate surfing. And hydroplate surfing happens when you're reading, for example, the overview chapter, and because there's so many concepts that cover so many different areas of science that there's no way that a single page or a single section can cover it all. So with the reference notes section, the frequently asked questions section, those are referenced within the text as a place to go to gain a further understanding on the concept that's being introduced. That's going to take you to another part of the book where you learn a lot more about that particular subject, and that may send you to another part of the book to even explain another subject that was introduced in that section. So you end up using a big chunk of the book. We call that hydroplate surfing. And these rabbit trails, you learn a whole lot, and it'll help you better understand the text. So feel free to move around the book as the notes and the highlights encourage you to do. The key assumptions, Kevin mentioned that at least half of the water that's in our current oceans were in the subterranean chambers about 60 miles below the surface, the 60 miles being the granite crust, part of the pre-flood Earth configuration, and that there was not the Pangea image that we get in the textbooks growing up, the Bullard depiction. The pre-flood Earth would have contained a single global crust, which would have pre-flood seas and mountains, perhaps up to maybe 5,000 feet, nowhere near the size of the mountains that we have today. And the third, it's a minor assumption, but a crack forms at the time of the rupture. And so going to how this originally formed during the creation period, we start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was out without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So before the flood of Noah, the very first part of the creation week, the earth was completely flooded with water, void of life, and Noah's flood was the second global flood. Genesis 1, 3 through 5, God created light. Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, then God said, let there be a firmament, or expanse, in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So, Kevin, why don't you go ahead and pick it up from there with the discussion of the firmament and the rakia?
Yeah, and this is the word translated, the Hebrew word translated firmament has created so much confusion in creation circles and just people that want to understand the Bible. And by the way, we're using the New King James version of the Bible throughout these podcasts, and all credit to the New King James, and we're using it as fair use. But firmament does not mean this misty vapor canopy that was above the earth, as almost every Christian was taught in the 60s and 70s, that was what this word firmament was meaning. It's not what it means in the Hebrew. It means expanse. It actually means a hammered out, something hammered out. And so when just the word firmament is used, it's referring to the crust, the expanse of the crust. When it says the firmaments of the heavens, it's talking about various different things in the heavens. And we get this in the frequently asked question number 27 on page 525 to 533, a very important frequently asked question. Did a water canopy surround the earth and contribute to the flood, as so many people think? And even recently, the guy that is still clinging to this canopy theory, he says, okay, it can't be a vapor canopy, but it's a crystal canopy. And so he envisions that the earth was surrounded by this crystalline water shell that held in the atmosphere, and which is completely untenable from the laws of physics. You can't have a crystal shell around the earth. And more importantly, we're going to see that this expanse was used to divide the waters to keep the earth from being a completely flooded at creation earth, as we'll explain in a minute. So again, the original earth that has just a mantle with water on it. That's the initial condition that we're about to expand upon, where God puts this firmament between those waters that were the shell around just the mantle. No liquid core, no solid inner core, just a mantle, water. And we're going to put a firmament that's going to separate those waters to be waters underneath the crust and waters above the crust, which is what the Bible strongly implies in this. And so we're posting up there a screenshot from Walt Brown's book titled, What Does Rakia Mean? That word firmament comes from the Hebrew word rakia, which usually translated expanse, not in the King James, but normally expanse. And so it's talking about the crust. And it's interesting to me, and Walt puts it in his book, that had you created an expanse to divide the waters with a sun and a moon created, then the gravitational attraction of the sun and the moon on that crust would have wanted to greatly destabilize that crust. But they're not created yet. So it's just the earth with water sticking in a crust. And so we're going to show an animation of a screenshot. Bill's going to share a screenshot of the animation done by Eric Donovan years ago for me, of how all of a sudden this crust, this expanse, this rakia gets put between the water layers of the creation day flooded earth without form and void. It starts out, there's just nothing but water above the mantle of the earth, and then God inserts, as we click on this, God is inserting this expanse between the waters, separating the waters above from below. For those people that think that it means an expanse in the heavens, if the earth is just mantle flooded, how are you going to allow the dry land to appear? The only way you can have the dry land appear is you put something in between there that is going to then morph into creating low elevation areas and high elevation areas, which we're going to show you next. And so, why don't we show them the next video, Bill, where then that expanse morphs by gravitational forces, taking heavier areas of that expanse are going to go down and touch the earth in several at the mantle in several different places through that ocean, and that's going to cause pre-flood seas to form in the areas where the pillars, the mantle is being is holding the base of the crust through these pillars. Those low level areas are going to become pre-flood seas, and the water in the subterranean chambers is then going to push up and cause the dry land to appear. So why don't we show that one now too, Bill? Okay, so now this expanse has been put in there. What the Bible is going to say is then God said, let the dry land appear. So look carefully. The crust is deforming. It's plastically deforming into pillars. The Bible talks about sockets, pillars. And so those pillars are touching down on the mantle, leaving an ocean of water trapped now below a continuous, like an onion shell, like an onion is made a bunch of layers. The water layer is sealed. There is a solid crust over the entire earth. But as that crust deforms and puts pillars down onto the mantle, it's going to then cause pre-flood seas, as you can see at the top, and pre-flood mountains, not near as deep a sea and not as high a mountain as we see in the earth today because of the changes that have occurred since the flood. And we have a cube view of this as well, if we want to do that. Okay, now here's a cube view of the same thing, showing the deformation of the crust as the pillars are coming down and creating, looking at the top, the waters that were on the top are now running into deeper places where the pillars were hitting the mantle, and the mountains are the pre-flood mountains, not anything like today, are coming up. So those two animations, we hope, will help you understand the clear reading of the scripture. He put an expanse between waters that he had created to flood the earth at the beginning, put that expanse between, and then he said, let the dry land appear by allowing that expanse to then separate the waters above from below to create dry ground. That's what the Bible tells us. As we go back to the text there, Bill.
Before I start with that, Kevin, I think it would be helpful for our audience to realize some preconceptions about our world, the things that you've heard about the flood, things that you've seen in our world, some preconceptions that may be hindering you from understanding what Kevin and I are teaching about the hydroplate theory and the deforming of the granite to form the pillars, the pre-flood seas and mountains, may be something that you're unfamiliar with because we're talking about granite, and the granite that you're used to, your frame of reference, are large granite blocks that to us are immovable and solid. And it would be hard to see how something like that could be formed into like a pillar without breaking apart. And the reason for that is that granite, once it's below 5 miles from the surface, acts very differently than the granite that we are used to seeing in granite mountains, for example. Once below 5 miles, the amount of weight that's on top of granite at and below 5 miles will exceed the crushing strength of the granite. And so if the granite is more than 5 miles deep and there's a portion of the granite that's exposed and doesn't have any kind of a compressive force on it, it will start to deform in that direction. And so because the pillar, the granite at the top of the subterranean chamber waters, the ceiling of it is the bottom of the granite. And because of the ability for granite to flow like a very, very thick putty, the heavier portions, the thicker portions of the granite would be drawn down by gravity, extruding down to the floor of the subterranean floor, which would be then touching down on the mantle and then actually probably pushing itself down in to form possibly something that would look like a socket. Well, once that material starts deforming down, that's going to causes the material above it to deform down as well. And that deepens areas where water can flow into. So more of the water that's on the surface is going to flow into those. And as the pillar comes down into the subterranean water chamber, it's going to displace water out of the way. So the water has to go somewhere. And it's going to push up on what is the ceiling of the subterranean water chamber, which is the bottom of the granite crust. And it's going to start pushing up, and that's when it's going to form the pre-flood mountains. And since the subterranean water chamber would be greater than a mile thick, the pre-flood mountains would be pushed up just about that much, not to exceed that. And so that's how the deformation of the granite would produce the pillars in which would form the pre-flood seas and possibly lakes, as well as the pre-flood mountains. And it's interesting that God created that he divided the waters with the firmament on day 2. And it's interesting about day 2 is that at the end of the creation activities on day 2, God did not say that he looked at it and that it was good. On the end of day 1, 3, 4, 5, it finishes up with a statement that it was good. And on the 6th day, God said it was very good. But on the 2nd day, God did not say that it was good. That indicates that there was quite possibly a process that was started on day 2 that was not completed on day 3. And quite possibly what that indicates is that on day 2, when the firmament was created in the midst of the waters, that's when the deformation started. And it wasn't until day 3 that was completed when the dry land appeared. And so that's one of those preconceptions about granite that would be helpful to consider.
Yeah, let's read Genesis 1:7 again, just to nail it down with what we've seen. Thus God made the firmament expanse. We want to say it's an expanse. It's a crust, a global crust, and divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And this also deceives people because they think, well, it says it's up in the heaven. How can it not be this canopy that goes around the world? It's got to be. That's what it says. Well, there's a possible variation to what heaven is because of the vowel placements in the Hebrew language. And Walt covers this in his frequently asked question, what triggered the flood, which is on page 480 and 485. So as Bill said, we're doing some surfing here. You can't read the overview chapter without going to these notes that he sends you to, and you're surfing all over the book. And the sidebar within what triggered the flood on 480 to 45 is, was there fire in the waters? And this is what it says. And you can see the screenshot on your screen here. Twice a day, the enormous weight of the entire Earth's crust tidally stretched and compressed the pillars and generated so much heat that the pillars would have glowed, and incandescent filaments in lamps do today. Even some burning may have occurred in the subterranean chamber. And then he references energy in the subterranean chamber on page 605. He means 606, and especially figure 266 with a 9 after it that wasn't supposed to be there. So we caught a typo here. And then this is the important part. One of the most famous and revered Hebrew scholars of all time, Rabbi Solomon Yetzke, which is AD 1040 to 1105, before Walt came up with the hydroplate theory a little bit, of France, proposed that the correct translation, he saw this is an incorrect translation. Even a Hebrew scholar saying, this is really saying, if you change the vowels around, it says, and God called the expanse fire in waters. So he called the expanse, instead of calling it heaven, a scholar 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, a Hebrew scholar, said that it really means, it should have read fire in waters, which is what the pillars would have been. As the pillars went down and separated the waters, the crust came down, it would have been fires in the water. And so that's a very important piece of information. Sometimes the translators can lead us astray in our Bible understanding. And then we show another picture here that comes from frequently asked question number 10. Did it rain before the flood? What generated the pre-flood mist? And so day 2, we see the granite between the waters. And then day 3, you see the pillars formed and the vault of water that is waters that are going to be escaping when the rupture occurs. And so once again, I want to emphasize Genesis 1:8 can by a Hebrew rabbi scholar could be saying, and God called the expanse fire and waters, which is what the crust became in the pillars in the great deep. So want to take it to Genesis 1:9, Bill?
Sure, Kevin. Just to kind of tag along with that, though, it was up until about 700 years ago, the Hebrew text did not contain any vowels. And in order to help pronunciation, scholars got together and decided to insert vowels into the words in order to make them easier to pronounce. And they used the context to determine which vowels to insert. And a good example I like to use is if you had the letters R, C, E, it's kind of hard to pronounce. And so if you would make the decision to insert an I, you would get rice. Or if you made the decision to insert the letter A, you'd get race. And so in this case, Rabbi Yitzhaki decided that a better vowel insertion would produce the term fire and waters. And we'll see as Walt describes because of the compression that we'll see here in a few minutes that the pillars went through, that compression would generate a huge amount of heat, causing those pillars quite possibly to glow and give the appearance, if one were to be down inside the subterranean waters and be able to look at it, it would look like fire and waters because the pillars would be glowing because of the amount of heat.
And in future podcasts, Bill, we'll be able to show the evidence supports the fact that those pillars got to thousands of degrees. And we'll cover that when we get to the asteroid and comet chapter.
Right. And so let's move on to Genesis 1:9. Then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So the process apparently was completed at that point. So another thing to consider is that the deformation, when granite deforms, it's going to produce heat. And that heat will reduce the crushing strength of the granite, which will further weaken the granite. So as the deformation starts, the pillar starts to move down, it starts generating heat, which the heat then causes the pillar to move even easier because the heat is decreasing the strength of the pillar. So the deformation is a combination of the pressure as well as the heat that the deformation causes.
And as a result, Walt has calculated that by all the potential energy, potential energy is, when you put a bowling ball up on top of your roof, it's sitting on the top of your roof and it's got energy. And when it rolls down your roof and smashes on the pavement, it changes that potential energy into kinetic energy, heat, and work on whatever it's damaging. So, it's a law of physics that potential energy, if you're losing potential energy, that energy has to be transferred into something. So if crust is going down, it's losing its potential energy and making it into thermal energy and work that it does in deforming the granite crust. And Walt determined that by the end of day 3, when that process is over, the crust has put down tens of thousands of feet down on the mantle, all underneath the, underneath the crust into the subterranean chambers. That process has generated enough heat to have brought the subterranean chamber water to supercritical temperatures, which we'll talk about more in future podcasts. But supercritical water has an extreme ability to dissolve minerals in granite. And so it's going to start working on the subterranean chamber ceiling and the floor and the mantle to start dissolving things, which will play a very big part in future podcasts. And the tidal pumping of the earth by the sun, when he makes the sun on the next creation day, it also is adding energy into the subterranean waters. And that's under technical note number 8, which is on page 603, and it's called tidal pumping 2 types. And that's another place you have to go surf. On the overview chapter, you have to surf over to the fact that there is energy being added to those subterranean chambers, water, as the earth is moving in and moving out, the potential energy being turned into thermal energy, increasing the temperature and pressure in the subterranean waters. And so Bill is, why don't you rattle off some of these verses that go along with what we've just said, where the Bible makes it perfectly clear, not so much in Genesis, but he makes it clear in other parts of the Bible. And these are on page 502 of frequently asked questions. Is the hydroplate theory consistent with the Bible?
Job 38, 4-6, God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations, its sockets fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone?" And in the Hebrew, that word means sockets.
Every place else in the Bible dealing with the tabernacle, that's translated sockets in it. And when you think about it, the pillars coming down and touching into the mantle, it's like a socket. It's how the Jews put their tabernacle together. They had a post that went into the socket of the bronze or silver sockets that were there. And so every other place it was made sockets, but here they call it foundations, which is the same.
Psalm 24, 1-2 says, "The earth is the Lord's, in all its fullness. The world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it," the crust, "upon the seas," the subterranean chambers, "and established it upon the waters." Psalm 33, 6-7. "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses." And it's interesting that the term storehouse, that indicates that there are divisions between the various storehouses, which sounds like the pillars. And also a storehouse is used to store something that you intend to use in a future date.
Yeah, and that future date was the flood of Noah. And then Psalm 104, verses 2 and 3, "Who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain." And that was another, Walt has a chapter on the stretching of the heavens, which answers all the universe questions that people are having. Completely consistent with what the Webb telescope is coming up with instead of the Big Bang, that God stretched out the heavens. And then verse 3, "He lays the beams, the pillars of his upper chamber, the crust, in the waters." He lays up his beams in the waters. And then Psalm 136:6, "To him who laid out the earth above the waters, for his mercy endures forever." He put the earth above the waters. And then finally, and we covered this in our first podcast, 2 Peter 3, 5-6, "For this they," scoffers of the Bible in context, "willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water." So the earth was standing in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. That the earth was flooded by the water that it was standing in before the flood occurred. So the Bible is perfectly clear. there is a layer of water underneath the earth, and that layer of water, ocean of water underneath the earth, was ruptured out, as we're going to see here in a few verses, ruptured out and flooded the earth. So the Bible's clear, and Walt started with the Bible, and everything flows from what the Bible says. And other theories, they start with plate tectonics, evolutionary theory, and try and make it fit the Bible, and it doesn't. There's more of an intro to the overview chapter than what we're covering here. So what we're going to do is actually make a second intro to the overview chapter next week, which will complete the rest of the phases, where we're going to have a continental drift phase where the mantle pops up into the area of the rupture and causes the continents to move to the right and left, to east and west, coming together in the Pacific, as we'll explain all that. And also just other ideas and views, especially comparing the mid-oceanic ridge picture of the ocean floor, comparing it to the narrative of the hydroplate theory compared to the catastrophic plate tectonic theory, and let you decide which theory has the evidence to support the narrative of the theory. So we want to thank you for joining us on this third podcast of HydroplateTheoryUniversity.com, associated YouTube channel, Hydroplate Theory University, 3 words for the YouTube channel. And hope you'll join us next week for more on this topic.
Thank you for viewing this episode of Hydroplate Theory University. We hope you'll return for future episodes. Please like and subscribe, spread the word, and be sure to visit creationscience.com, where you can find more great hydroplate resources.